Hi everyone, my name is Ruan Rong and I'm a PhD student from the University of Edinburgh. Today, I will introduce our research work RigidFusion, which is about dynamic SLAM in environments with large rigid objects. Traditional SLAM usually assumes that the whole environment is static. However, it's important to handle dynamic environments, and it becomes much challenging when other dynamic objects are considered. For example, in an unmanned warehouse, in addition to the robot itself, there are also other robots which it works together with. Besides, in the task of mobile manipulation, the robot needs to consider the manipulated objects and other collaborators like humans. Also, in this research work, we focus on large dynamic objects. Large usually refers to the object size, but here we are more interested in proportion. This means that even if an object size is not that large, if this object is close to a camera, it could also occlude a large proportion of the camera view. In the area of dynamic SLAM, the methods can be categorized into direct methods and indirect methods. Direct methods can detect dynamic objects directly and remove them before camera tracking. One typical example is mask fusion, which uses mask RCN to directly remove certain categories of objects like humans or teddy bears. But this method requires users to know the object category in advance. In contrast, indirect methods can robustly track camera in dynamic environments. For example, static fusion tracks the major component of the images. The remaining parts with high residue is detected as dynamic objects and removed as outliers. Cold fusion further treats connected outlier areas as a new object and is able to track multiple dynamic objects independently. However, both static fusion and cold fusion assume that in the visual input, the static background occupies the major component. This means that if a dynamic object is large, it could be treated as a part of static background. To demonstrate it, we run both static fusion and cold fusion on a real sequence, where the camera moves forward and the large dynamic object moves closely in the front. Results show that both static fusion and cold fusion fail to detect the large dynamic object, but map parts of the dynamic object into the static background model. The estimated camera trajectories are not correct either. To solve the problem caused by large occlusion, we formalize it in the scenario of mobile manipulation, where a robot needs to simultaneously travel in the environment and manipulate a large object closely. Here the blue cylinder belongs to the static background, and the red box is dynamic. While in real applications, the robot doesn't know the shape or appearance of objects around it in advance. So the visual input would look like this, and we are unable to tell which part belongs to the static background or dynamic objects. But we further assume that we have prior information about how the static and dynamic objects move relative to camera using robot proprioception. For example, the camera motion prior can be acquired from wheel odometry. And since the dynamic object is physically manipulated, we could also know object motion prior from arm kinematics. With the further assumption that the whole dynamic component is rigid, our final goal is to simultaneously estimate the segmentation between the static and dynamic rigid bodies and track the motions of these two rigid bodies respectively. To achieve this goal, our pipeline takes RGB images as input and over-segment them into clusters to reduce computation complexity. Then, with the motion priors from robot proprioception, we further separate rigid bodies with different motions and track them independently. Finally, the static segment, which is marked blue, is used to reconstruct the static background, while the dynamic segment is used to model the dynamic object. More concrete, for motion estimation, let's generally consider two RGB frames A and B, and each contains n pixels. In static environments, we only need to estimate camera eagle motion. This can be achieved by minimizing the intensity and depth residues over all pixels. Here, gamma represents the probability that a pixel belongs to the steady background. This is used to weight the residues so that only pixels belongs to the steady background can have a high contribution. So in steady environments, the gamma equals to 1 for all pixels. Compared to SLAM in static environments, our method RigidFusion will consider an extra dynamic segment. Here we use one-man's gamma to represent the whole dynamic component. In addition to optimizing two transformations, we also need to find the optimal segmentation gamma. Besides these two residual terms, we further add a regularization term to penalize the difference between estimated motions and motion priors. In real experiments, we mount the RGB camera on the base of real robot ADA and also put large static boxes on U-boat. The ground truth trajectories are acquired from Wacom system, and there are also two sources to acquire motion priors. One is real wheel odometry. The other is adding simulated drift on ground truth. We first show qualitative results, and as you can see in the external camera view, there's a large dynamic object moves closely to the camera. It also causes large occlusion in the visual input. Results show that RigidFusion can detect the dynamic object occlusion and remove it from the steady background. We further compare our method RigidFusion with other state-of-the-art dynamic SLAM methods, including static fusion and cold fusion. As shown in the visual input, when camera moves forward, there's one large dynamic object with another small static box in the front of camera. Neither static fusion nor cold fusion can detect the dynamic object, but map it into the steady background reconstruction. While our method RigidFusion can still recover correct camera trajectory, even in this very challenging situation, when the dynamic object occupies a much larger proportion than the steady background. Lastly, for better visualization, we plot trajectories from top-down perspective into a 2D plane. Besides the black line, which is the ground truth, the other two interesting trajectories are first, the black dashed line, which is the camera motion prior we use, and the red line, which is our method RigidFusion. It shows that RigidFusion not only outperforms all other state-of-the-art methods, but it's much better than the motion prior it uses. We further collect 8 sequences and show the results in these two tables. RigidFusion outperforms all state-of-the-art methods in nearly all sequences. In conclusion, we propose a pipeline named RigidFusion, which simultaneously segment, track, and reconstruct the static background and a single large dynamic rigid body from RGB sequences. We also enable dense SLAM in environments with large occlusion and release our dataset with ground truth trajectories. The major limitation of our method is that we model the whole dynamic component with a single rigid transformation and are hence unable to track multiple dynamic objects. In the future, we will extend RigidFusion to handle multiple large dynamic objects and track them independently. Thanks for listening.